Relations committees he sits on, Democratic Senator Chris Coons of Delaware. Senator, good to see you this morning. Joyce Vance was on a short time ago, the former federal prosecutor, making a distinction between what Congress should see in the Mueller report, she believes unredacted, and what the public should see, where you may redact sensitive information, grand jury testimony, classified information, things like that. Are you confident that you will see the unredacted Mueller report from the Attorney General?
No, I'm not, and that's one of my main concerns. The ways in which the Attorney General has sought to restrict, control, redact this report has created more confusion rather than more transparency. He came before us in his confirmation hearing and pledged that he would lean in towards transparency, and I still remain hopeful that we will find ways to achieve transparency, but everything he's done so far, from his very short summary of his version of the highlights of the report released publicly to the ways in which he's proceeding with redaction, I think both don't fit with the regulations and don't fit with his commitment to full transparency.
Are you sympathetic at all, Senator, to his argument that there are parts of this, there may be elements of the Mueller report in those 300-some pages that even you as a sitting senator shouldn't see?
I think he's got an argument that to the extent it would interfere with an ongoing investigation, and as we all know, there are several ongoing investigations, that is a legitimate law enforcement-based argument for not providing it publicly. The Senate is fully capable of receiving classified information. As we know, one of the core things that the Mueller report confirmed was the breadth and depth and intent of the Russian interference campaign in our 2016 presidential elections. There's no reason we shouldn't be able to see the national security portions of this in a classified annex. And frankly, in previous very similar contexts, a court has ordered the release of grand jury information in the interests of public transparency.
So do you suspect then, Senator, what Jerry Nadler has suggested and did so again yesterday, that this is headed for a subpoena then? The only way that you will see it is that way?
That may well end up being the case. Unfortunately, a subpoena process can take a very long time to enforce. So we should be trying to get as much out of the Attorney General voluntarily as we can before turning to a subpoena in the House, if that's ultimately what happens.
Senator, I don't know if you could stand by and listen to this. Keir Simmons, you have Vladimir Putin's first reaction to the report. Tell us about it.
Yeah, well, look, we really know that we're living in an era of post-truth politics when you have Vladimir Putin claiming that the Attorney General's summary exonerates the Kremlin. It does nothing of the sort, but Vladimir Putin is, trying to spin. He is saying that the Muller inquiry was a mountain and out of it has come a mouse. The objective for the Russians being that they want to try and get sanctions lifted. They want to try and pivot on the end of the Mueller report to say, you see, we did nothing wrong, and we should be free to trade and be involved in the U.S. By the way, there are multiple very rich Russians who are desperate to get back into working in the U.S. and being able to trade with U.S. companies. And I will say one thing. I think we need to disabuse ourselves of the idea that Putin is some kind of Machiavellian, incredibly brilliant mind who has manipulated American politics. In fact, in many ways, what's happened with Russia is a disaster for them because by intervening in the way they did, they have made it more likely that the sanctions are tougher and will continue.
Senator, any concerns you have about Putin's response?
Well, it's striking that the two people who are repeatedly and publicly saying they're fully exonerated by the Mueller report are President Trump and Vladimir Putin. I don't think there's anyone here in my party, in my caucus, who believes that this report fully exonerates either our president or Vladimir Putin. That's exactly why getting the details in this report, in particular about obstruction, where the Attorney General reached his own conclusion and did not leave it to us to carry out our constitutional duty to conduct oversight and to be better informed about whether or not the president violated the American people's trust and his constitutional duty to see that the laws are fully and fairly enforced. That is something that is appropriate for Congress to see this report to be able to act on.
All right, Walter Isaacson and then Meacham. Walter.
Senator, good morning to you. I was wondering, why don't the Democrats just wait, see what Barr delivers? He seems like he's trying to get to the right place. There will be some redactions. He'll explain why. Then maybe there can be a discussion of what's in those redactions. It seems like people are trying to pump this up before there might be a resolution. He seems pretty sincere in heading in the correct direction.
Walter, that may end up being the case, and next week I may be surprised by a fulsome release of this report. The key thing that made me uncomfortable with his nomination was that he sent an unsolicited 18-page memo into the Department of Justice that directly critiqued what he believed to be Robert Mueller's argument on obstruction of justice. Not an obvious or simple thing for someone in private practice to do. That he weighed in proactively on the argument on obstruction of justice, and then he insisted himself on reaching a conclusion about obstruction, which the special counsel did not, gives me real concern. I agree with you, Walter, that before moving towards a subpoena or some other measure, we should wait and see what the Attorney General releases. But given that particular piece of his recent conduct, I'm skeptical.
Senator Keir Simmons here. To what extent do you think that the focus on Mueller has also meant a focus on Russia, which has been greater than perhaps is in the interests of America? Because there's another, kind of elephant in the room, and that's China.
Yes.
And of course, Russia will not be the only enemy of America that will want to try to intervene in American domestic affairs and perhaps even politics in the future. Has enough been done to try and protect the U.S. domestic political system going forward?
Not enough. And one of the key lessons we need to learn from the 2016 presidential election is that it's exactly the openness of our society, the ways in which social media is a powerful and almost completely unregulated influence in our campaigns, that we need to do more to strengthen our electoral systems. We did send out about $350 million in grants, 2 years ago, but we have not yet done everything we could to strengthen the partnership between the federal government, in particular our law enforcement and intelligence communities, and the thousands of local officials and boards that are responsible for carrying out and protecting our elections. You're absolutely right. I view China as the greatest competitor, as the greatest threat to our role in the world in this century. And we need to be working together to find ways that we can cooperate or compete with China in order to avoid what may otherwise be a conflict, in particular over future interference in our elections by countries other than Russia, perhaps principally China.
Meacham.
Senator, one thing that links two of the dominant stories of yesterday, but stories of the age, the family separation and the president's remarks about that, and the Russia questions, is this fear of the rule, about the future of the rule of law. One of the things the president said, and I'm paraphrasing slightly, yesterday is, we have courts that rule against us all the time, which to a lot of folks translates as a kind of warning, a flashing yellow light, if you will, that you may have a president at some point defying court orders. You may have a breakdown of basic norms in terms of the separation of powers. To what extent, in your caucus and among your Republican colleagues, is this a source of conversation? Do you all war game, if you will? What's the worst case scenario if this guy really loses it?
It is a legitimate and widely shared source of concern, John, that President Trump repeatedly says things that suggest both that he views the press as, and this is a great phrase, the enemy of the people, and that he views judges and courts as illegitimate. I'll remind you, one of the first things President Trump did that showed this anti-immigrant inclination was the so-called Muslim ban. He campaigned on saying he was going to ban Muslims from entering our country, and then one of his first executive orders was that so-called Muslim ban. It was temporarily restrained by a court. My own home community, the church I grew up in, was at the time working with one of our local mosques and synagogues to welcome a Syrian refugee family that was blocked from coming to this country by that judge's, the president's executive order was temporarily blocked by that action, and the family was able to come to this country. ultimately, that Muslim ban was, in a revised form, upheld by our Supreme Court. In just a few minutes, just an hour later this morning, I'm going to be introducing a bill with a wide range of senators and House members that would prevent this president or a future president from imposing a similar religiously based ban on folks coming into this country, narrowing his powers. This is not a bill that I expect to become law in this administration. But every Democratic senator running for president is a co-sponsor, and I think it's important that we put out a marker that says we will not engage as a party in the kinds of family separation actions, whether at the border or by preventing families from reuniting based on religion. This is just not who we are. There are ways that we can secure our border and secure our country without intentionally and cruelly dividing families. And I do worry, as do many of my colleagues, John, that the president is increasingly unlikely to keep following the rule of law should he be reelected.
Yeah. Senator Chris Coons, thank you, and thank you for introducing that bill. Doris Kearns Goodwin, we're at a point where a bill like